7 months after the largest invasion. 7 months since humanity made Xenos think it was actually raining men. 7 months since humanity had basically played whack-a-mole with the enemy fleet. 7 months after this battle, they had finally taken the last of the Mugen territory. It was 100% liberated. They no longer liked the sound of that old title. They really didn't. They wanted something else. They initially holded a vote and wanted to do the human hegemony. This, of course, was quickly rejected, as no humans wanted this. Those inside the former faction were confused. They figured that humans would want complete and total control. Well, this was not the human way anymore, not since they reached up into space. They knew how bad hegemonies end up, how fast they end up being dictatorial, and how fast they end up falling apart. This is something they had to learn the hard way through history, through trial and error many, many times, and they did not want this to happen. As they moved into the final sectors of what used to be Mugen territory, they found that they had been left abandoned by the previous factions. This was not surprising, as these territories were not exactly worth much. Definitely not worth wasting entire fleets, battle groups, and stations over. Absolutely not. This meant that the territory was secured very easily, as humans jumped in and then simply had to wait for their allied counterparts. They allowed the allies to take over the system themselves, not only to give them experience, but to not scare the crap out of the few slaves that remained. Those that were there were barely hanging on, but they were given care as much as possible. The humans took very, very large precautions to make sure that as many survived as possible. And with these final movements, the slaves that were taken were free. The homeworlds that had been liberated in this territory, this former faction territory, had been freed, and they owed it all to one species that really, really hated bullies. They looked around to each other and realized that their species will survive, though some just barely, as either one side all their females were taken, or on another side all the males were taken. One side would obviously be able to repopulate a whole lot faster. However, this did not help with the diversity of genetics they would need to spread out, though many of them were content with their homeworlds and the territory that was allocated to them by the humans and, of course, the liberation fleet of their allies. During this time of peace, humanity reached out to the other three factions, and they asked for peace talks. They asked several times if the factions wanted to actually survive, as humanity could simply roll their fleet into their territory. Allies were not happy with the idea of having any type of peace, as they had seen the sheer power of humanity's vessels, the sheer rage that comes from their soldiers, and how quickly and efficiency they can take things apart. They expected humanity to just bulwark all the way across the universe, taking down sector after sector, species after species, forcing those that held others in chains to become those in chains themselves, or face the wrath of humanity as they would drop down onto the planet and seemingly slaughter all of them, face to face if necessary. They expected this, but what they got in return was a surprise, that humans were calling for some sort of peaceful resolution. What they didn't know is that humanity had mobilized everything, and if they did want to spread out to all three factions, they would be fighting not just the front that was the old Mugen territory, but instead facing three different armies at the same time. Along with that, they would have to defend all the different areas. They just did not have the personnel. They had the firepower, sure, but they did not have the personnel to stretch across at this time, nor did they want to. They had got their blood. They had gotten their revenge. But to the rest of the universe, this seemed as though humanity suddenly had a malfunction in their processor or something. Originally, the calls for peace were regarded by the factions as a call to surrender by the humans. They believed the humans had simply bled themselves out trying to take the former territory and now realized that if they did not surrender, if they did not fall in line, then they would simply be crushed under the combined forces. Because of this, they continued to build up their forces, making unholy defenses in preparation for the humans to simply turn their guns in their directions. They were absolutely surprised when humans were actually calling for a parley. They were completely floored by this. More surprised at the location itself. The location was on a space station just inside the lines, inside the former Mugenslute territory. They looked at this with a little bit of contention. They wanted more time to prep their fleets before they agreed to meet. However, the conditions for the meeting were simple. They could bring one ship, and only one ship, for each representative of their faction, which meant there would be 3 ships arriving. They would have full diplomatic authority at that point, meaning that any treaty they signed was for their entire faction, barring absolutely none within its own borders. The meeting itself would be sent out to each and every faction. They would be able to see exactly what was going on, and everything would be translated for them if they so required it. However, most factions simply turned their nose up and said they would translate it themselves, believing that they were superior. Though one thing surprised them. They were all expecting to get a nice deal from the humans, maybe for some of their weapons or engines or something. They brought riches, they bought slaves in order to barter with the human representative. However, when they looked closer at the agreement, they found out that there was going to be absolutely no deals made in private. All treaties must be signed in front of all parties. All meetings must be held in front of all parties. The terms that they brought to the table were simply to either be agreed with or not, and that was all. The factions themselves decided to take their time responding, a typical power play that all humans are aware of. The humans had to wait 3 months before the factions finally agreed to show up at the same place at the same time. It would take another month from there before the meeting actually took place. The faction vessels arrived to see the station completely repaired and overhauled. They were amazed at how clean it was, how well maintained it was. How was this even possible? The station they're looking at was abandoned several decades ago. It should have been beat to hell by just rogue asteroids going through. What is going on? As they looked off in the distance, they could see a single human battleship waiting, just sitting there, just like a cloud in the sky, not moving, not powering up, just sitting there. The factions were a bit nervous, of course, as they asked for docking coordinates. They weren't just asking, but in a way, demanding. Tell us where, now, and things of that nature were commonplace, although the response they got was very kind. Please head over to Docking Bay, whatever the number might be for their particular faction. A very calm voice, sometimes in their own language, which they were surprised. Usually the voice they got is some sort of mechanical something or other. They weren't exactly sure what the hell it was to start with. The faction ships eventually dock, and the diplomats are shown to the conference room area. The conference room itself is rather large, which is a very large, oval-shaped table in the center, open on one end, with over 40 seats surrounding it. It was impressive to see. As they looked, they could see that every single place to sit had a different symbol on it. Many of the factions were confused at this. They didn't understand many of the symbols that they saw. They started to figure a few of them out until they saw the symbol for their own faction on their own seats. To their absolute surprise, the seats had been arranged, designed, and set in a way that made their seating comfortable. There was room for wings if they had them, tails if they had them. There was perches if they wanted to do so. It was surprisingly comfortable, and they commended this. As they sit, the human representative actually walks in carrying a mound of documents in the form of data pads, along with several assistants. The assistants seem to be hurrying as they're putting the tablets in front of where the representatives sit and along the width and length of the table in front of every single seat. It was a surprise. The faction leaders were motioned to sit down, but they would not do so until the slaves that they brought in pulled out their chair for them and allowed them to sit in a very pompous manner. The human rep was trying desperately to hide his contempt through a very stoic face, but he could feel that he was having trouble keeping it. Once they sat, the human representative thanked them for coming, but asked them to wait for the others to join. The faction leaders looked at each other and simply said, "Others?" With that, representative of all the freed species that the humans had freed in the past several years walked in. They walked around, found their seats, and sat down without a single word, though they did not hide any of their contempt or anger for the faction members that were there. Several even looked at the slaves and were visibly upset, some of them ruffling feathers, some of them bringing their spikes up, others slamming their tails on the ground in frustration. And with this, the human simply raised a strange wooden piece, clapped it onto the table, and called everything to order. Once everyone was sitting, the human representative admitted that he had not called them here under any pretense of surrender, or to offer terms, or anything of that nature, but to simply try to broker some sort of peace treaty, some sort of non-aggression pact. That way, they wouldn't be at each other's throats, and humanity would not have to kill them all. He continued by motioning out and saying how he has freed the former races of the Mugen Sloot territory, and that the faction itself does not exist anymore. There is no Mugen Sloot faction. There is different species holding on to their own small slice of this massive universe they call home. Each of the species now has its own territory. This was enough to make the other factions seemingly surprised, confused, and visibly upset at the same time. The human representative continued by saying, each species from here on out will have to grow on its own. Each species here will have to protect themselves. Each species here will have to trade under its own guidelines as it works between other species as well. They will need to do this as humanity is going to return to its own territory. If you so decide to sign this non-aggression pact with us, the war is over. The war is over for one simple reason. You have lost. The faction leaders were visibly upset at this, and in front of them is the peace treaty. I'm going to give you time to look this over. I'm sure you have already read it on the way here. However, I want you to read this again to see that it has not changed. The faction leaders look at it closely and begin to scroll through with whatever appendage they can use, trying to see if there is any adjustments from the original document sent. They see nothing has changed, and they are not happy. The faction leaders turned to each other and argued at the demand that they must return all the slaves if they assign this sort of non-aggression pact. And by all the slaves, humanity has not minced word. It is actually capitalized. All the slaves, every single one of them. Without the return of the slaves, there will be no peace deal. There will be no trade deals. And no removal of the travel restrictions either. This is non-negotiable. This is solid inside the non-aggression pact that you are to sign. This is not going to be something you can barter with or anything like that. One of the faction leaders, the Pol Shitar, decided to boast a little bit.
We will never surrender to humans. Slaves must know their place.
He then pulls on the chain hard, pulling the slave close to one area of the body and seemingly forcing it to service him in front of everyone. Everyone knew what he was doing, as this was supposedly a sign of dominance amongst all the factions, showing that they have complete control over everyone under them. The Queshfart representative tells him, "Read the room." With that, he looks around, and the entire room is so angry at this display that they are about to jump out of their seats and rip him apart. The human representative calmly states, "That sort of action is unwelcome in this chamber. Please stop at this moment."
"Do not dictate to me!"
The faction leader screamed at him. The human representative simply spoke again. Need I remind you, sir, that I am sitting here as the only thing stopping the rest of these species in this room from ripping you to pieces. Their respect for us and our procedures in this non-aggression pact meeting is the only reason that violence is not allowed, nor is whatever in the hell your slave is doing at this moment." With this, the faction leader pushed the slave away and thought about what he was doing, began to scroll through, and his head got closer to the data pad.
"Are you telling me if we sign this, then we are signing this not with humans, but with all those in attendance?"
Yes, you are. With this, the Queshfart representative decided to ask for some time to get the slaves released. The other factions, even hearing this, were beyond pissed, as though they were betraying their trifecta alliance. The human representative had to speak up and interject over them, saying, "The timeline is written in the treaty, and there is nothing I can do about that." The Queshfart representative continues to dive their face into the datapad, trying to look for anything, while the others sit there and berate them for being weak, for laying their head down, for getting on their knees for something as simple as humanity. The representative then lifts his head and begins to ask for more time. The timeline, he could see, is roughly 3 human years. Given the size of the faction, they will have to cut corners and rush everything out, as this will not be enough time. Additional time, however, is not given. The human representative states very clearly, "No extra time will be given. It is stated in there the exact timeline. I cannot change it. You cannot change it. As no extra time is going to be given so you can try and breed a new generation and hide them somewhere. No extra time will be given to build a hidden facility to hide the slave populations. No extra time is going to be given so you can shuttle slaves around to try and mistake the numbers, make it seem like you're actually doing the right thing by giving them up. No extra time will be given to sell your slaves either to make a quick profit. And before you try to alter this deal, understand this. One of the most vile type of humans known has designed this agreement. Though absolutely abhorrent and much more dangerous than even the forces that we sent down to take planets, it is a necessary evil that we humans call lawyers. There's no way around this treaty once it has been signed. We have already signed it, and it will not be altered because of that. And neither will we. And with that, I'm going to bring out an old human phrase which I believe echoes the sentiments of everyone you see over here staying silent. They will say, "Let my people go." The faction leaders begin to argue with each other again. The other species sit silently with looks of complete malice and contempt at the faction leaders. The factions do ask for more time to contact their governments, which is far from an unreasonable request, and the time was given. A recess was struck, and they would reconvene in 24 hours. As they went to leave, the human representative said something to them that they suddenly stopped moving to listen. "Oh, by the way, don't try to run. Don't forget about that battleship-class warship parked outside." With this comment, many of the species knew that the faction leaders were cowards and they might just make a run for it. With this realization, many of them seemed to smirk in their own way. The human representative continued, "By the way, slavery is illegal within these sectors. Either release those slaves you are holding on to right now, or you're going to be charged with trafficking, which carries a very steep penalty, up to and including death." The faction leaders look at their slaves, look at the chains, look around the room, and hesitantly drop the chains themselves. The human representative actually gets up and walks over to the slaves and sees that they have kind of a soft collar. It's not the hard metal that they had, but no, this is more for the pleasure slaves, as you don't want to damage them. The human seemingly stuck their digits underneath it, seemed to twist a certain way, and to everyone's absolute horror, was able to rip clean the collar as it came free from them. They were then motioned over to their own brethren, waiting for them to show up. With absolute glee, they grabbed a hold of the free slaves. The free slaves, in their own version of crying tears of happiness, grabbed onto their brethren and were immediately ushered away. 24 hours later, the council reconvened. The human looked at the representatives as all the others sat there silent, waiting for the response. He asked for their decision. Yea or nay, yes or no, what is your call? The Queshvark representative was the first one to speak. We have agreed to your terms, provided only unarmed human ships come into one sector that we will choose. Any further into our territory, and we will not surrender the slaves. But if you send a maximum, no more, but certainly less, than 5 ships at a time, then we will gladly transfer the slaves to your ships. However, notice that any warships that you may send will be seen as an act of aggression. This is something we cannot allow inside our borders. The human is seen turning, raising his hand up and seeming to listening to an earpiece. He then raises his head and looks. No issues with the timeline? None. With this, the Paul Shitar and the Deadlock representatives immediately stand. The Bolshevik representative speaks.
We refuse to be forced into financial and military ruin by such unappealing creatures. You lack comprehension of our true might. Only death and chains await for those that would dare enter our territory, try and take what is ours by right.
The Deadlock was already standing when they started to speak. We concur with the Bolshitar. Those lost, holding territory unfit for even raiding parties, is nothing in comparison to our true strength. The Queshvark representative didn't even stand. Please reconsider. We attempted to subjugate them when they were at their weakest. Our subjugation fleet could not take a single one of their worlds when they were at their weakest. Now they use weapons that can destroy planets. Are you serious going to go to war with them?
You may cower in fear of these little hairless mammals, but we do not.
Both faction leaders immediately turned and started heading towards the door. The human representative actually stood up to address everything. Before you leave this chamber, there are 3 things you must know. This made the representatives pause, but not turn around. 1. When you choose to come back to this table, the deal will not be so generous. 2. The pleasure slaves you brought to bribe me have already been removed from your ships. As stated before, slavery is illegal, and they've already been returned to their associated species. Even without them turning, their body language showed that they were visibly pissed off at this. 3rd, understand that if you invade any territory held by the members of this council, waving his hands wide to accentuate this, then you will have officially declared war on every member of this council. Should you decide such a course of action, be sure to sign this document and return it to us. With that, he simply raised the datapad, swiped his hand across it. Those representatives, still having datapads in their hands, raised them up as a new document appeared in their own language. On top said Geneva Conventions. They simply looked at this, did their own version of a scoff, and left. The Queshfart ref leaves soon after, but politely excused themselves. After they left, one of the other species went over to the human, said,
"That went better than I expected. 1 out of 3? I didn't expect to get any."
After the meeting, the territory lines pretty much settled and commerce resumed. Slaves were returned en masse by the thousands. The Queshfart, for all their troubles, for all their depravity, for all their screwed up ways of doing things, they were true to their word. However, the slaves that showed up, frankly, looked like shit. Most of them emaciated, most of them sick, many of them beaten, and many of them taken advantage of and barely mentally there. But they're still alive, and that was the important part. Humans seemed to take special care of those that were returning. This surprised all the slaves, as it was the first time seeing a human. Though the first time they saw any, it looked like they were bipedal machines, and they were scared out of their mind. Thankfully, they did have a few of their own allied forces there to kind of calm things down. The humans, taking extremely good care not to risk breaking the treaty as they went into the space, made sure that there were absolutely no weapons. Although what the Queshfart didn't know is they always had their finger on the scuttling charge. If the Queshfart decided to go crazy or go froggy and jump, well, they were going to find out that asset denial is definitely a thing. Once the timeline was actually finished, and everyone was able to send all sorts of probes through, all sorts of messages through, and they found out that the Queshfart had actually truly been up on its word, even though they were financially crippled at this point. They were still a military powerhouse. The kicker of it all is they realized that they needed help if they wanted to survive. Less than a decade later, the Palshitar and the Deshneverk forces began to subjugate Queshfart territory. They began slowly and started taking out small colonies. The Queshfart, for everything that was going on, was able to hold out against them and actually push them back to the territorial lines thanks to trade with their new, well, I guess you could call them friends inside the human liberated territory. Even though they were able to push them back, they were slowly losing ground, and they knew it. Eventually, they began to ask for help. They did get some from some of the other species, but it was very limited, as many of them took the old phrase from humans, "not our fight, not our war," but they would simply supply them with the arms, munitions, ships, and things of that nature so that they can continue to fight on to protect their own territories. Humanity, for all its strength, just sat back and watched it all happen. They held back not because they didn't care, but because the non-aggressive pact was just that, non-aggression. It did not require them to come and help out. They simply stayed within their own territory. It got so rare to see humans that they almost became items of myth to the young ones. They all knew how powerful humanity was, but humanity didn't want to merge with anyone else. They simply wanted to build up their own technology so that they could continue to research things. They seemed to be fine fighting with each other instead of going out and hurting anyone else. Though as the battles between the factions raised, they were asked, why were humans so apathetic? Why could you be so unfeeling? They were asked, after seeing humanity's capacity for war, rage, anger, fury, but compassion, caring, love, how could they suddenly simply turn that off? Did they flick a switch? How could they do that? Everyone was confused about the duality of man. No one understood it. which is why they always ask the humans, "Are you humans or machines?" And they would always get the same line back. Would we figure it out ourselves? We'll let you know.